We know that rules and norms determine the distribution of power across economic agents. However, the power agents have can be monetized. The power affects how the rents from economic interaction are spread across economic agents. The distribution of rents, however, exposes the risks of social conflict and opens up opportunities for positive societal change. Social conflict and social change can happen in two scenarios. The first one is when agents are not happy about the distribution of rents from the social interaction because they think the distribution is inherently unfair. The second one is when the rents are not efficiently distributed among agents. That is, when there is a room for Pareto improvement of the economic outcomes. In both cases, there is room for change in the rules of the game, which can potentially reshape how the game is being played and how the rents are distributed as a result of the play. We study these interactions with the help of a simple model of social conflict. As any model of social interaction, it will involve players, payoffs, rules of the game, and optimal responses. So keep watching to learn more about the history of social conflict and social change. In the model, there are two players, the farmer and the landowner. Initially, they're just the farmer, Angela, who comes to the plot of land, assumes ownership, and works to create fruits for herself. In this initial institutional setup, Bruno, the landowner, has no role. But then the landowner Bruno shows up in two very different shapes. In the beginning, he shows up as the guy with the gun and can use this force to make Angela work for him as a slave. But as time goes by, institutions change and Angela starts negotiating. Bruno, meanwhile, has lost his power to force, to coerce Angela to do whatever he says, and will have to accept a certain rent. So, there are two forms in which Bruno can come into the model. Note that those two forms depend entirely on the rules of the game, on the institutional structure of the game, and crucially, on whether Bruno can force Angela or he's forced to negotiate a rent with her. And in the final, modern version of society, which the model represents, Angela receives the right to vote and to change the rules under which both her and Bruno operate. As a result, Bruno is forced to consider what is optimal for Angela, not only for himself. As is always with models, we'll evaluate the distribution of outcomes based on whether they can lead to Pareto improvement or not, and whether they're fair to begin with. So, how is the model developed? This is the well-known feasibility constraint that Angela is facing. If Angela has no free time whatsoever and works 24 hours per day, she can produce 12 bushels of grain. On the other hand, if Angela works 0 hours and enjoys 24 hours of free time, she will not produce any bushels of grain at the end of the day. The feasibility frontier then shows the maximum amount of output she can produce with a certain hours of free time. Note also that the feasibility constraint is concave to the origin. This means that as Angela reduces her hours of free time and starts working longer hours, her marginal productivity of labor gradually declines. That is, initially her output increases by a lot. But then, as she gets tired from working, every additional hour of work produces less output than before. As in any individual level maximization problem, our economic agent is trying to maximize something, subject to their individual feasibility constraint. We figured out the constraint, but what is Angela trying to maximize? Well, she enjoys food and free time and seeks an optimal balance between the two, given her feasible set of options. Graphically, she is trying to ride on the highest possible indifference curve, which just touches her feasibility constraint. As before, when we talked about individual optimization, being on a lower indifference curve does not maximize her happiness, does not give her the optimal combination of free time and consumption, while being on a higher indifference curve is just not feasible. And as a result, there is just one point sitting on both the feasibility constraint and the indifference curve, which satisfies both conditions. It both maximizes consumer welfare, but is also feasible. This combination is 9 bushels of grain that Angela produces in 8 hours of work and 16 hours of free time, which she spends enjoying the fruits of her labor and the late October sun. Notice also that at her optimal point, the rate at which she is ready to substitute free time for food to stay equally happy is exactly equal to the rate at which she can physically transform free time into food. In other words, her marginal rate of substitution and her marginal rate of physical transformation are equal. But now, Bruno shows up. Bruno showing up is a fundamental change in the way the economy operates, because Angela can no longer enjoy the fruits of her own labor. When Bruno shows up and demands a certain share of the product because he's got a gun on Angela, Angela's feasible frontier becomes the feasibility constraint for the entire mini economy that Angela and Bruno have created for themselves. So how is the output that Angela produces, distributed between Angela and Bruno? One of the ways to distribute the produce is 50-50, right? If Angela works 12 hours and produces 10.5 bushels of grain, she can allocate half of it to Bruno so that Bruno hides his gun. In this case, both will get an equal fraction of the output. Angela will work 12 hours and will still have 12 hours of free time. In general, the entire feasibility constraint is populated with feasible allocations of output between Angela and Bruno. 2 examples are these points F and G, which just showed up in the figure. Note that point H is not feasible, because Angela also needs to survive on what she has produced for herself. Although point H is technically feasible, Angela would not be able to physically survive with 0 food, even though she would still be able to enjoy 12 hours of free time. If I may use this probably inappropriate comparison, Nazi Germans tried an allocation at point H at some point, and it did not work well at all, when millions of people starved to death in concentration camps. So what is a feasible set is not only constrained from above by the physical ability of Angela to produce, it is also constrained from below by her physical need to eat before she's able to produce. Therefore, we need to also model Angela's biological survival constraint. Modeling her survival constraint is kind of easy. On the one hand, even if she spends her entire day gazing at the sun, she still needs to eat something, right? Let's say she needs at least 2.5 bushels of grain per day to survive, even if she does not work at all. After all, you need to eat, even if you are unemployed. But then notice that as she starts working, she starts burning more calories and needs more food to be able to keep working an additional hour. So her need to eat increases as she works more because she becomes increasingly tired. As she approaches 24 hours of work per day, she's so tired that to make a tiny extra effort, she needs to be generously compensated with more and more food. This is why her biological survival constraint begins to rapidly rise after a certain point. As a result of all this, the set of feasible allocations that Angela and Bruno can rely on is actually much smaller than we have initially thought. It is located in this shaded area, which we call the technically feasible set. The technically feasible set is the overlap between what is technically possible to produce and what is biologically feasible to produce, given how much Angela needs to eat to survive. So let's see how the conflict between these two economic agents develops. Recall that Bruno has a gun and can demand any working hours from Angela that suit him, as long as it is in the technically feasible set. So how does he think? What's his thinking process? Let's start with the allocation, which used to be optimal for Angela. 9 bushels of grain and 16 hours of free time. Bruno can let Angela work for 8 hours and produce 9 hours of grain. But is this the best that Bruno can do? Is this the best he can extract from Angela? To be able to answer this question, we need to notice the slopes of the biological survival constraint and the feasible frontier. Why are they important? The feasible frontier was the rate at which Angela produces. The biological survival constraint, on the other hand, is the rate at which Angela consumes to be able to survive and keep producing. Notice that at 16 hours of free time, Angela produces grain at a rate which is much faster than the rate at which she eats for survival. How do we know? Well, look at the slopes. The slope of the feasibility constraint is steeper, so the rate is much higher. As a result, Bruno can force Angela to work a bit more, a bit harder. He will pay her enough to survive, but she will give him back more than what she gets from him in return. So Bruno will make Angela work more. But how much more exactly? The two rates are equal at 13 hours of free time and 11 hours of work for Angela. At 13 hours of free time, Angela produces grain at a rate which offsets her physical need to survive. At that point, Bruno maximizes his own welfare. He extracts the maximum from Angela. If he becomes too greedy and makes Angela work even harder, she will start needing more grain to survive than she produces in an extra hour of work. As this will eat up Bruno's profits, Bruno is definitely better off at point B than at any further point to the left. So the rules of the game are such that Angela gets just about enough to survive from Bruno, and Bruno gets the rest. In effect, Bruno owns the labor services of Angela. Social history up until the late 19th century has a very good example of this kind of labor relationships between slave owners and slaves. The model here can explain the optimizing behavior of slave owners at the time. In our live lectures this week, we'll talk about extensions to this fascinating model. We'll see what happens when the government bans slavery, luckily, and introduces bargaining between two agents who are free to interact rather than just one of them coercing the other to do something. We'll also keep looking for the efficient and fair allocations under the new social contracts. Now is a good time to conclude for the week. The conclusion comes in the next video. Thanks for watching.